When I was young, I couldn't speak English properly. I couldn't understand movies. I couldn't follow native speakers. And whenever I tried to talk, my tongue would twist, my confidence would fall, and my words would disappear. But one day I decided, if I cannot learn English in school, I will learn it in life. I made a promise to myself that I will turn my home into my classroom, my mirror into my teacher, and my voice into my practice partner. That was the day my journey began. The first thing I learned was that English doesn't come from books alone. It comes from practice, from mistakes, from trying again and again, even when nobody listens. Every morning I stood in front of the mirror and talked to myself in English. I didn't care if I was wrong. I talked about my day, my dreams, my plans. Sometimes I even argued with myself in English. People thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. Because every time I spoke, I became a little better. My confidence grew, not because my English was perfect, but because I dared to open my mouth. The second thing I learned was that your environment doesn't need to be foreign to be powerful. You don't have to travel abroad to improve your English. You can create your own English world at home. I changed my phone language to English. I listened to English songs, not just for entertainment, but to feel the rhythm of the language. I watched English movies and repeated the dialogues until my pronunciation matched theirs. When I didn't understand a word, I paused, looked it up, and repeated it again. Slowly, English became not something I studied, but something I lived with. Another powerful method I used was listening and imitation. I found recordings of great speakers and listened to them every day. I didn't just listen. I mimicked their tone, their expressions, their pauses. I wanted to feel what English feels like, not just what it sounds like. I realized that learning English is not about memorizing words. It's about training your ear and your mouth to work together. Just like a musician learns by listening to music, a speaker learns by listening to speech. One of the hardest parts was overcoming fear of judgment, fear of mistakes, fear of being laughed at. But then I realized when a child learns to walk, they fall many times, yet nobody laughs at them. Everyone encourages them. So why should I be afraid of falling in language? Every mistake became a lesson. Every correction became progress. I started to enjoy my mistakes because they showed that I was moving forward. Reading also played a big part in my growth. I read simple English books, stories, and articles every day. I didn't rush to finish them. I read slowly, carefully, feeling the words. I wrote down new vocabulary, made sentences, and used them in my daily speech. I didn't just memorize words. I made them part of my thinking. Slowly, I stopped translating from my native language to English. English started to flow naturally because it became part of how I thought. Then came writing. Writing helped me connect my thoughts with words. Every night I wrote a short paragraph in English about my day. It didn't matter how small. What mattered was consistency. Over time, my sentences became clearer, my thoughts more organized. I understood that writing is not just a skill, it's a mirror of how clearly you think. The most surprising part was that the more I practiced English, the more I understood myself. Learning a language is not just about words, it's about confidence, discipline, and persistence. It teaches you how to face failure and how to rise again. It makes you humble because you realize there's always something new to learn. I also learned to surround myself with English. When I walked, I listened to English podcasts. When I ate, I watched English videos. When I rested, I dreamed in English. My environment became my teacher. I didn't need to wait for opportunities. I created them. Many people say, I can't improve my English because I don't have anyone to practice with. But the truth is, your best partner is you. You don't need perfect conditions. You need consistent effort. I didn't have a tutor, a class, or expensive courses. What I had was curiosity, persistence, and the belief that small steps every day can create big changes over time. Looking back, I realized something powerful. English didn't just change my communication. It changed my confidence, my opportunities, my life. It opened doors I never imagined I could walk through. It allowed me to connect with people around the world, to share ideas, to learn from others. So if you're sitting at home thinking you can't do it, remember this. You don't need to be born fluent. You need to be born determined. You don't need a perfect accent. You need a fearless attitude. You don't need the best teacher. You need the best mindset. Because the real classroom is not out there. It's right where you are. Would you like me to continue this speech with an inspiring closing paragraph in the same Jack Ma style? When I decided to improve my English, I realized that waiting for the perfect environment or an English-speaking community was just an excuse. So I turned my home into my English classroom. Every corner of my house became a place to learn, to listen, to speak, and to think in English. I didn't need a teacher standing in front of me or a classroom full of students. What I needed was commitment, creativity, and consistency. I understood that if I wanted to master English, I had to bring it into my daily life. I began with the smallest Habits. When I woke up, I greeted myself in English. When I looked in the mirror, I described my appearance and my mood in English. I started talking to myself about my plans for the day, what I wanted to do, what I was thinking, and even how I was feeling. It might sound strange, but talking to yourself is one of the most powerful ways to build fluency. It breaks the fear of speaking and helps you think faster in English. The more I practiced this, the more natural it became. My home was no longer just a home. It was a place where English lived with me. I also labeled things around my house. My desk had a label, my mirror, my door, my chair, even my toothbrush. Every object had a name, and I used those names every time I interacted with them. When I poured water, I said, "I'm pouring water." When I cooked, I said, "I'm cooking breakfast." It was like living inside an English world that I had created myself. My environment became my teacher. Slowly, I started to think in English without even realizing it. The language stopped being something I had to study and started becoming part of my thoughts, my actions, my day-to-day life. To make learning more exciting, I surrounded myself with English content. I listened to English songs and tried to understand the lyrics. I watched English movies with subtitles, then again without them. I listened carefully to how actors spoke, how they expressed emotions, how they connected their words. I would pause a movie and repeat the lines aloud until I could match the pronunciation and rhythm. My living room became my pronunciation lab. Every time I repeated a phrase, I felt a sense of progress. I started imitating accents, not to sound perfect, but to train my ears to different tones and flows. Slowly, my pronunciation improved, my listening became sharper, and my confidence grew. Reading also became part of my home routine. I pull ASED English books, magazines, and even small notes in places I often visited. On the table, near the bed, by the window. Whenever I had a few minutes, I picked up something to read. It didn't have to be long or complicated. It just had to be in English. When I came across a new word, I didn't just memorize it. I made sentences with it, used it in my conversations, and repeated it until it became part of my vocabulary. I realized that reading at home, surrounded by quiet, helped me focus better and understand deeply. Listening was another key part of my home learning environment. I played English podcasts while cooking, while cleaning, and even while resting. I didn't always understand everything, but I didn't stop listening. The goal was not perfection, but exposure. The more I listened, the more patterns I started recognizing. I noticed how native speakers connected words, how they shortened phrases, how their tone changed with emotion. This natural exposure helped me understand English in a way that books alone never could. Writing became my evening practice. At the end of the day, I wrote about what I did, what I learned, what I felt. Sometimes it was just a few lines, but it helped me connect my thoughts to my words. My notebook became a silent friend who never judged my mistakes. I corrected my grammar, checked my spelling, and read my own writing aloud to improve fluency. Over time, I noticed that my writing and speaking started to improve together because both were connected to how I thought in English. My phone and computer also became part of my home classroom. I changed their language settings to English. Every notification, every button, every message came to me in English. It forced me to read, understand, and think in English all the time. Even my shopping lists and reminders were written in English. Every small interaction added to my learning. I also joined online discussion groups and language exchange chats, not to show off, but to practice. I didn't worry about being perfect. I just wanted to communicate. The more I engaged, the more confident I became. Even when I was resting, I found ways to stay connected with English. I listened to motivational talks and repeated powerful lines. I watched interviews and observed body language. I spoke aloud as if I were part of the conversation. My home was not silent anymore. It was filled with English words, expressions, and sounds. Every day felt like attending a new class, but one designed entirely by me. The truth I discovered was simple but powerful. If you can make your home your learning zone, you never stop improving. There's no pressure, no deadlines, no fear of embarrassment. You learn freely, at your own pace, with passion. You learn not because you have to, but because you want to. That's how your home becomes the most powerful school you could ever attend. When I started speaking English, I made so many mistakes that sometimes I felt embarrassed even to try again. But then I realized something important. Perfection is not the goal. Progress is. So I made a decision that no matter how many times I failed, I would keep speaking every single day. I promised myself that even if I had nobody to talk to, I would still talk. Even if my pronunciation was wrong, I would still continue. Because I understood that the biggest enemy of learning any language is silence. Every time you stay quiet, you lose a chance to grow. Every time you speak, even imperfectly, you take one step closer to fluency. So I made daily speaking practice my habit, my discipline, my secret weapon. Every morning before my day began, I stood in front of the mirror and talked to myself in English. I didn't wait for someone to ask me questions. I asked myself. I said things like, how are you feeling today? What will you do today? And what did you learn yesterday? It felt strange in the beginning. I stumbled over words, forgot what I wanted to say, and sometimes laughed at myself. But slowly the fear disappeared. Speaking to my reflection became natural. It became my daily warm-up for confidence. Talking to myself was not about showing fluency. It was about building fluency. It helped me hear my own voice, correct my mistakes, and express my thoughts freely. I also created situations in my head. I imagined that I was at a restaurant ordering food in English. I imagined I was meeting someone new and introducing myself. I imagined I was explaining my opinion in a meeting. These small mental exercises trained my brain to respond in English. I didn't need real situations because I created them myself. The power of imagination became my practice partner. I realized that the more I imagined speaking in English, the easier it became to speak when real situations arrived. Sometimes when I walked around the house or went for a walk outside, I practiced thinking in English. I described everything I saw, the trees, the people, the sky, the colors. I said things like, the weather is beautiful today, or that person looks happy. This simple activity trained my mind to stop translating from my native language. I started forming sentences directly in English. It was a big step because real fluency begins in the mind, not in the mouth. Once your thoughts start forming in English, speaking becomes effortless. One of the hardest things to overcome was fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being judged, fear of sounding strange. But then I reminded myself that everyone who learns a language makes mistakes. Even native speakers make mistakes sometimes. The difference is they don't stop talking because of them. So why should I? I gave myself permission to sound funny. I gave myself permission to fail. I gave myself permission to learn out loud. The moment I stopped being afraid of mistakes, my confidence grew 10 times stronger. Mistakes became my teachers. Each one showed me what to improve next. Another thing I practiced was recording my voice. I spoke about any topic for a few minutes and listened to it again. At first, it was uncomfortable to hear my own voice, but then I began to notice things I could fix: pronunciation, speed, tone. I compared my recordings week by week and saw real progress. It motivated me because I could hear myself getting better. This simple habit of self-recording turned into a mirror for my voice. It taught me that improvement is not always visible. Sometimes you can hear it. Whenever I felt lazy or unmotivated, I reminded myself that even 5 minutes of speaking was better than nothing. Some days I only practiced short conversations. Other days I spoke for longer periods, pretending I was giving a speech or teaching a lesson. The goal wasn't time, it was consistency. I learned that fluency is built not in one big effort, but in small daily efforts that never stop. Speaking every day, no matter how little, trains your mouth, your brain, and your confidence to work together. Sometimes I practiced with the help of videos. I listened to English speakers on YouTube or in interviews, paused the video, and repeated their sentences. I copied their tone, their rhythm, their pronunciation. It was like having free teachers all around me. I didn't just listen passively. I participated. I made their words my practice sentences. This technique made me feel connected to real English, not just textbook English. I also practiced conversations online. I found people who wanted to improve their English too and talked to them through voice messages or video calls. We both made mistakes, we both laughed, but we both learned. Speaking with others helped me learn to listen and respond naturally. It gave me real communication experience which books alone could never teach. There were days when I didn't feel confident at all. My mind was tired, my tongue stumbled, my words came out wrong, but I still practiced. I told myself that even bad practice is better than no practice. Every time I spoke, I improved something, maybe a sound, maybe a phrase, maybe just my courage. I understood that confidence is not a gift, it's a result of repetition. The more you speak, the more your fear fades. The more you practice, the more your mind believes that you can do it. Speaking daily changed the way I approached English completely. I stopped waiting for opportunities to speak and started creating them. I stopped worrying about my accent and focused on my message. I stopped comparing myself to others and focused on my own progress. And through that daily practice, I realized that fluency is not just about speaking English. It's about believing in yourself enough to speak without hesitation. When I realized that learning English was not only about studying from books, but about surrounding myself with the language, everything changed. I stopped treating English like a subject and started treating it like a lifestyle. I made a decision to fill my world with English, in my ears, my eyes, my thoughts, and even my free time. I understood that if I could make English part of my daily environment, my learning would become effortless. I didn't need to live in an English-speaking country to learn. I needed to bring English into my own space. So I surrounded myself with English media, songs, movies, podcasts, and everything that helped me stay connected with the sound and rhythm of the language. Every morning I started my day with English sounds. Instead of listening to random music, I listened to English songs carefully. I focused on the lyrics, repeated the words, and tried to understand their meaning. When I didn't understand something, I searched for the lie. Ricks and read along. I started to notice how singers connected words, how pronunciation flowed smoothly, and how emotions were expressed through tone. Sometimes I sang along just to practice pronunciation and rhythm. It was not about singing well, it was about speaking naturally. This habit made English feel alive in my day. Movies became my teachers too. I watched them not for entertainment, but for learning. At first, I used subtitles in my native language to understand the story. Then I switched to English subtitles. Finally, I challenged myself to watch without any subtitles at all. Every movie taught me something: new expressions, everyday conversations, real pronunciation, and even the cultural way people use English. I paused, replayed, and repeated the dialogues aloud. I tried to copy how the actors spoke. This made me realize that movies are not just for fun, they are lessons hidden in stories. Every film became a classroom where I could listen, repeat, and improve without feeling bored. Podcasts became a big part of my journey too. I listened while walking, cleaning, or cooking. I chose topics I enjoyed: motivation, self-growth, and storytelling. The best part was that podcasts made me listen to natural, real-life English. It wasn't like textbook English, it was how people truly spoke. I didn't worry about understanding every word. I focused on the overall meaning. Over time, my listening improved naturally. My ears started catching words that I had missed before. I realized that listening daily trained my brain to recognize patterns and pronunciation automatically. YouTube became my virtual classroom. I subscribed to English channels, pronunciation guides, motivational talks, interviews, and language tips. I didn't just watch passively. I interacted with the content. I repeated phrases, wrote down useful sentences, and practiced them later. Sometimes I mimicked the speaker's energy and style, trying to match their tone and pace. I also watched English news and documentaries to expose myself to formal language and different accents. It made me more comfortable with understanding different ways people speak English around the world. My phone and social media became part of my English environment too. I changed all my app settings to English. Every notification, every message, every instruction came in English. It forced me to read and think in the language every single day. I followed English pages, read English posts, and even commented in English. Scrolling through social media became a learning activity instead of just a distraction. The more English I saw and read, the more naturally it entered my daily thinking. Even my free time became a source of learning. When I wanted to relax, I watched interviews of successful people in English. I focused on how they spoke, their vocabulary, and their tone. I listened to how they answered questions and used expressions. Sometimes I repeated their lines like a shadow speaker, listening to one line and saying it immediately after. This shadowing method improved my fluency and made my speech more natural. It helped me to think and speak faster in English. Reading English media also played an important role. I read English articles, short stories, and news online. I didn't always understand everything, but I didn't stop reading. The goal was to expose myself to as many real English sentences as possible. I underlined new words, looked up their meanings, and used them in my writing and de-speaking practice. Over time, my vocabulary expanded naturally. I didn't have to memorize word lists anymore because words started sticking in my mind through constant exposure. There were days when I didn't have much time, but I still made sure that at least one English sound reached my ears. Even listening for 10 minutes made a difference. The key was consistency, not perfection. By surrounding myself with English every day, I made learning automatic. My brain began to process English as something normal, not something foreign. The sounds, the rhythm, and the flow became familiar. The fear of speaking slowly disappeared because my ears were trained to recognize and reproduce what they heard. This constant exposure also helped me understand cultural expressions, humor, and slang. I started noticing how context changed the meaning of words. Watching and listening to native speakers taught me not only the language, but also the emotion behind it. I learned how tone could change the entire meaning of a sentence. I learned that real communication is not about knowing every word, but about feeling the language. I realized that when you surround yourself with English, you don't have to force yourself to study. Learning becomes part of your lifestyle. You don't count hours or lessons. You simply live with the language. The songs, the movies, the podcasts, and the conversations you hear every day slowly shape the way you think, the way you speak, and the way you understand. Over time, you stop noticing that you're learning because English becomes part of who you are. When I started learning English, I realized that one of the most effective ways to improve was by listening and imitation. I learned that English is not just a language of words, it's a language of sound, tone, and rhythm. You can read books for years, memorize grammar, and still struggle to speak if your ear is not trained. That's why I began focusing on listening carefully and imitating what I heard. I turned my ears into my teachers and my voice into my practice tool. Listening and imitation became my secret formula for learning naturally, just like a child learns their first language. In the beginning, I listened to everything I could find. Interviews, speeches, podcasts, and conversations. I wasn't trying to understand every word. I was trying to catch the sound of the language, the flow, the emotion. I realized that understanding doesn't come first. Familiarity does. When your brain gets used to hearing English daily, it starts recognizing patterns automatically. I didn't need to translate everything. I just needed to feel the rhythm. The more I listened, the easier it became to predict what came next in a sentence. It was like training my brain to think in English sounds instead of my native language. Then I started imitating. I picked short audio clips from movies, interviews, and speeches and listened carefully. I repeated every word exactly as I heard it. The pronunciation, the pauses, the emotion, even the breathing. It wasn't easy at first. I felt strange, like I was acting. But that's what learning a language truly is. Acting until it becomes real. I realized that when you imitate native speakers, you are not just copying words, you are training your mouth muscles to move differently. English has sounds that don't exist in other languages, and you can only master them through repetition and imitation. One of the techniques that helped me most was songs. Shadowing, I would play a short clip and try to speak along with the speaker, matching their speed and tone in real time. It was difficult at the beginning because I couldn't keep up, but I kept trying. I repeated the same clip many times until I could almost say every line without missing a beat. This exercise trained my listening and speaking together. It made me faster, more confident, and more natural. Over time, my pronunciation improved because I wasn't just speaking English. I was speaking it the way it is supposed to sound. I also learned the importance of listening with focus. Instead of hearing English as background noise, I paid attention to details, how words were connected, how some letters disappeared when spoken quickly, how intonation changed with emotion. For example, I noticed how native speakers often link words, saying gonna instead of going to, or wanna instead of want to. These small patterns are never written in textbooks, but they make your speech sound natural. By listening closely, I learned to speak like people actually do, not like a grammar book. I practiced listening everywhere. While walking, I played English podcasts. While eating, I watched English shows. Even when I didn't fully understand, I didn't stop. I kept exposing my mind to the sound of English. Slowly, it became familiar, even comforting. I started thinking in English phrases I had heard before. Sometimes I caught myself using expressions I didn't even remember learning. That's the magic of imitation, that your brain absorbs what it hears repeatedly without you realizing it. When I listened to great speakers, I didn't just focus on their words, I focused on their energy. I studied how they started sentences, how they paused, how they used emotion in their voice. I realized that confidence in speaking doesn't come from knowing every word. It comes from how you deliver your message. So I imitated that energy. I practiced speaking loudly, clearly, and with expression. I stood in front of the mirror and delivered lines from speeches, copying gestures and facial expressions. It made me more expressive and comfortable with the language. Sometimes I used movies for imitation practice. I paused scenes and repeated the dialogue line by line. I tried to copy the emotion, the pronunciation, and the tone exactly. It was like performing, but every time I did it, my speaking improved. Over time, I began to develop my own voice in English. I didn't sound like anyone else, but I carried the confidence and rhythm I had learned from listening and imitation. Listening also helped me understand different accents. English is spoken differently around the world: British, American, Australian, and many others. At first, it was confusing, but the more I listened, the easier it became to understand everyone. My ears learned to adapt. I could understand English spoken fast, slow, formal, or casual. It made communication easier because I wasn't shocked by new accents anymore. I also recorded myself while practicing imitation. Listening to my recordings showed me what needed improvement. Maybe my pronunciation was off, or maybe I wasn't speaking clearly enough. It became a feedback system. I didn't need a teacher to correct me. My own recordings became my guide. Every week, I could hear progress. My voice started to sound smoother, my sentences more fluent, and my tone more natural. Through listening and imitation, I discovered a truth about language learning. You don't learn English only with your eyes by reading. You learn it with your ears and your mouth. The more you hear, the more your mind adapts. The more you imitate, the more your speech improves. This method requires patience, but it builds a strong foundation. It doesn't matter where you are or what level you start from. If you listen daily and imitate consistently, your fluency will grow naturally without even realizing how much you've improved. Reading and writing were the two habits that transformed the way I learned English. I discovered that reading fills your mind with words and expressions, and writing helps you organize and express those words in your own way. These two skills build each other like two sides of the same coin. When I began focusing on them, my vocabulary expanded, my thinking in English became sharper, and I started to express myself more confidently. I didn't wait for perfect materials or advanced books. I started small with what I had and built from there. The goal was not to read everything, but to read something every day and write something every day. That simple rule changed everything about how I learned. At first, reading English felt slow and difficult. I used to read one paragraph and stop to look up every unfamiliar word. It was frustrating. But I learned to let go of perfection. Instead of trying to understand every single word, I focused on understanding the meaning. I started with simple English books, children's stories, and short articles online. They were easy to follow and they kept me interested. As I read more, I noticed certain words appearing again and again. Those words became familiar, and soon they became part of my active vocabulary. Reading didn't just teach me new words. It taught me how words work together, how sentences were built, and how ideas flowed naturally in English. I made reading part of my daily routine. I kept an English book or article near my bed so I could read before sleeping or right after waking up. Sometimes I read for just 10 minutes, sometimes for longer, but I made sure I never skipped a day. Consistency mattered more than time. The more I read, the easier it became. My eyes got used to the structure of English sentences and my mind started to think in English without effort. Reading also improved my grammar naturally because I saw how correct sentences were formed again and again. I didn't memorize grammar rules. I absorbed them. I also used reading as a way to learn about topics I loved. I read motivational stories, business articles, and success interviews. This made learning enjoyable because I wasn't just studying the language. I was learning ideas that inspired me. When you read what you love, you don't feel bored or tired. The knowledge becomes more meaningful, and the English becomes easier to remember. Every new book or article I read opened my mind not just to new words, but to new ways of thinking. Writing was the second half of my practice. I began with very simple steps. Every day, I wrote a few sentences about my day, what I did, what I learned, or how I felt. At first, I made a lot of mistakes. My grammar was weak, and my sentences felt broken. But I kept going. I didn't erase my mistakes. I learned from them. Writing gave me a way to connect my thoughts to English words. It forced me to think clearly and express ideas in a structured way. Over time, I started to enjoy it. Writing in English became my habit of self-reflection. As I practiced more, I began to write longer paragraphs and short essays. Sometimes I described things around me. Other times I wrote about topics I had read earlier. This connection between reading and writing strengthened my understanding. The words I learned from reading appeared naturally in my writing. I didn't have to memorize them. My brain used them automatically. Writing also helped me remember grammar rules without studying them directly because I was applying them every time I wrote. I also tried a useful method, rewriting what I had read. After reading an article or story, I would close the book and try to write the same story in my own words. This helped me improve both my vocabulary and comprehension. It forced me to think deeply about what I had read and how to explain it in English. It was like teaching myself the same lesson twice, first by reading, then by writing. This simple habit made a big difference in how quickly I improved. Sometimes I shared my writing online in small communities where people helped correct each other. Their feedback helped me see my mistakes clearly. I didn't feel discouraged. Instead, I was thankful because every correction was a chance to grow. Writing for others also gave me motivation to be more careful and creative with my words. The more I wrote, the more natural it felt. My sentences became smoother, my ideas clearer, and my confidence stronger. Reading also inspired my imagination. When I read stories, I learned how to describe things, how to express emotion, and how to use language beautifully. I noticed how writers used metaphors, how they built suspense, and how they made words come alive. I tried to use those techniques in my own writing, even in small ways. Little by little, my writing became more expressive. I made a rule for myself. Every new word I learned from reading had to be used in a sentence or short paragraph I wrote that day. This way, the word stayed in my memory longer. Writing forced me to use what I learned instead of just remembering it passively. It's one thing to recognize a word when you see it, but it's another thing to use it correctly in your own sentence. That's how true understanding develops. Sometimes I read aloud what I had written. It helped me hear the rhythm of my sentences and fix the ones that sounded unnatural. It also doubled as speaking practice. Reading aloud from books or my own writing made my pronunciation better and improved my confidence in speaking. This simple link between reading, writing, and speaking made my learning more complete. The more I practiced reading and writing, the more I understood that they were not separate skills. Reading feeds your brain with information, and writing gives your brain a way to release it. Reading shows you what good English looks like, and writing helps you build your own version of it. Together, they strengthen your ability to think clearly. And when I began learning English, one of the biggest challenges was fear. The fear of speaking wrong, the fear of being laughed at, the fear of not sounding good enough. That fear was stronger than any grammar rule or vocabulary list. It stopped me from opening my mouth even when I knew the right words. But over time, I learned that fear doesn't disappear by waiting for confidence. Confidence comes only after you face your fear. I realized that if I wanted to improve, I had to stop being afraid of making mistakes and start seeing them as steps to progress. Every successful learner once sounded broken, uncertain, and shy. What made them better was not perfection, but persistence. In the beginning, whenever I tried to speak, I would freeze. My heart would race, my hands would shake, and my mind would go blank. I was afraid that people would judge my accent or laugh at my grammar. I used to compare myself with fluent speakers and feel small. But one day, I asked myself a simple question: how will I ever get better if I never try? That question changed my mindset. I decided that from that moment on, I would speak English even if I made 10 mistakes in one sentence. I told myself that making mistakes is proof that I'm learning. Because when you stop making mistakes, it only means you've stopped learning. So I began to speak more. I spoke to myself, to friends, to strangers online, and even to my mirror. Every time I spoke, I made errors, but I didn't stop. Sometimes people corrected me, sometimes they didn't, but I always learned something new. I learned that real progress happens when you use the language, not when you only study it. Speaking without fear became my daily practice. It was not about being perfect. It was about being brave. Each time I opened my mouth, I felt a little more confident, a little less afraid. I also learned that confidence doesn't come from knowing every word. It comes from believing that your message matters more than your mistakes. People don't remember your grammar, they remember your energy and your effort. When I focused on expressing my ideas instead of worrying about being correct, my communication improved naturally. I stopped trying to sound perfect and started trying to sound real. That small shift in focus made a huge difference in how I felt about speaking English. There were times when I felt like giving up. After all, learning a language takes time, and it's easy to feel frustrated when progress seems slow. But I reminded myself that every small step mattered. I learned to celebrate little victories. Understanding a movie without subtitles, having a short conversation with confidence, writing a paragraph without help. Each small achievement became fuel to keep going. I realized that persistence is more powerful than talent. Even if you are not the best student, if you keep moving forward, you will eventually get there. Another thing that helped me overcome fear was changing how I spoke to myself. Instead of saying, I can't speak well, I started saying, I'm improving every day. Instead of thinking, my English is bad, I thought my English is growing. These small affirmations changed how I felt inside. The mind listens to what you tell it. If you constantly say you can't, you'll never try. But if you tell yourself that you're capable, your brain starts believing it. Confidence begins in the mind before it shows in your speech. I also surrounded myself with people who encouraged me instead of criticizing me. I joined groups where learners helped each other, not judged each other. We laughed at our mistakes together and corrected them kindly. Being in a positive environment made me realize that everyone struggles at some point, no matter their level. The fear of being judged disappeared because I wasn't alone in my journey. Learning English became something joyful instead of stressful. I practiced speaking even in private moments. When I was alone, I narrated what I was doing in English, describing my actions, my thoughts, my plans. This constant practice made English a natural part of my daily life. I didn't need an audience to practice. I only needed consistency. Over time, this habit reduced my hesitation. I no longer paused to translate sentences in my head. The words began to flow because I had trained myself to speak without overthinking. Another thing that helped me was focusing on effort rather than results. Some days I spoke fluently, Other days I made silly mistakes. But I learned that progress isn't a straight line. There are ups and downs, but every attempt still moves you forward. I stopped expecting perfection and started appreciating practice. The more I accepted my imperfections, the faster I improved. The moment I stopped being afraid of sounding wrong, I started sounding more natural. Overcoming fear also meant accepting my accent. I used to feel insecure about how I sounded because I didn't have a native accent, but I realized that an accent is not a mistake. It's a sign of your effort and identity. It shows that you are bilingual, that you have learned something new. The goal is not to erase your accent, but to make your speech clear and confident. Once I accepted this, I stopped trying to sound like someone else and focused on expressing myself genuinely. Persistence became the foundation of my learning. I practiced even when I didn't feel like it, even when I thought I wasn't improving. I understood that fluency is built in small, invisible steps. Every word spoken, every mistake corrected, every fear faced adds up to progress. The secret is not doing it perfectly, but doing it consistently. With time, persistence builds skill, and skill builds confidence. Through this journey, I learned that fear fades only when you face it again and again. The first time you speak, your voice shakes. The second time it shakes less. The third time it starts to sound normal. And one day you realize you're speaking freely without even thinking about it. That's the reward of persistence. The transformation that happens slowly, quietly, but powerfully